personal gain.
I think we should assume that any vulnerabilities at our southern border are open for authoritarian influence of many kinds. I think that's a safe assumption. If the gaps are there, then those who are working against us are going to use them to their advantage.
Calls to address the issue are on the rise.
With the threat of terror, fentanyl and other illicit drugs that are coming in, and the human trafficking that's going on, I think it should be called to attention, because is the communist Chinese government exploiting our southern border being open, just like they've done with fentanyl?
Fentanyl has killed more Americans than car accidents and cancer. To put it in perspective, the drug killed over 70,000 Americans in 2021. That's about one person every 8 minutes. The drug flow breaking families in the U.S.
Now, if we had Chinese troops lining up along our southern border with weapons aimed at our people, with weapons of mass destruction aimed at our cities, you damn well know you would do something about it.
You would hope.
We had a weather balloon from China going across our country. Nobody died, and everybody's freaking out about it. But 100,000 die every year, and nothing's being done. Not enough is being done. Numbers are going up, not down. And you talk about children being taken away from their parents. My children were taken away from me.
An illusion. A pretty little newspaper, and I'm sorry.
I said, no, you're fine. Keep going. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. And yeah, and so they found that this charging station has 98 high-speed Tesla chargers. There's a diesel generating plant located behind the Shell station that's adjacent to the chargers, and it's providing power to obviously, of course, people think, I guess they think the power comes from just the sky or something, and but something has to generate the electricity that enables those chargers to recharge those batteries. And Tesla operates this charging station and decided they needed that diesel generating plant, and they strategically located it behind the Shell station.
You gotta make sure you at least give them like the peace of mind that it's all electric, right? I mean, are these things common? I mean, is it just this one station, or do a lot of them have like hidden diesel generators?
I actually found one at a supermarket down in Houston where I used to live. This was 5 or 6 years ago. They had taken away several of the handicapped parking spots, the best parking spots, in the parking lot, and put Tesla chargers in those spaces, so the few people that owned EVs at the time in Houston could park in luxury there at the grocery store. And around behind the grocery store was a diesel generator. The store manager told me this, and I went and looked at it. He took me out there to see it. That came on every time a car pulled up to recharge. That diesel generator came on and provided the power for it. And this industry is going through a lot of growing pains. The infrastructure just is not there. And Tesla's way out in front of all these other car makers in the EV space here in the United States, and is doing whatever it needs to do to ensure electricity goes to these chargers, so that the drivers that in California, who is the biggest market for Tesla and their automobiles, they want to make sure they can charge their cars as they're driving through the Central Valley. And the diesel generators are doing the job.
Well, you mentioned California.
Project in America, around the world really, and they're in very short supply. It's taking up to 4 years to source new supplies of these transformers. The inventories are very low, and you can't expand the grid if you don't have the equipment to do it with. And the federal government is not doing anything to solve this problem. We've been very fortunate in this hurricane season that we haven't had a major storm like Hurricane Harvey that comes through and shuts off power across a wide geographical area this year, and hopefully we'll get through this season without that happening, because honestly it would be in some areas of the country, it might even be impossible to restore power within months if it gets knocked out because of this transformer issue.
Important stuff. David, thanks again for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Holds on American soil. One of these cartel bases was actually recently raided by Texas Rangers, and accompanying them on the raid was Todd Bensman, Senior National Security Fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies. He joins us now to talk about this. Hey, Todd, thanks for being here.
Good to be here again.
So, what is this cartel base that just got raided?
Right. So, I mean, this is a really unusual and interesting development down on the border. Remember, the crisis at the border is multifaceted. It is not just about millions of illegal immigrants crossing it. There are ultra-violent, vicious drug smuggling cartels on the other side who are in and among all of the immigrants and in different parts of the border. And there is a direct correlation between them too. But there is an area near Roma, Texas. Fronton is the name of the small village. And there's an island in the middle of the Rio Grande right there at Fronton that both Mexico and the United States forgot who it belonged to. And a long time ago, nobody could remember. And so unless you have permission of the other government, you can't go on. So both governments would stay off of this island, which made it a no man's land, which means it became cartel land. It was perfect. And so it's 170 acres. Nobody would go on it. It became kind of a safe zone for all kinds of hard drug smuggling and weapons smuggling south and cash smuggling south. And there were main guys over there who were spending a lot of time in Fronton and in that whole area, intimidating the population and running drugs. And finally, Texas just said, hey, let's figure out who owns this island. Things are really bad, and they did surveys, figured out the whole island belonged to Texas, and they went in and just took it back. Said, this is ours. They planted the Texas flag, the whole thing. Went in with papers, and it's not over. This is just beginning. They do not plan to leave. They are clearing all of the brush, 170 acres of brush. They're just going to turn it into like a parking lot out there and then put bunkers in, forward operating bases, and they're going to just keep it. And that's kind of the story there.
I mean, is this an anomaly? Are there other bases like this that we know of? I mean, how common is this?
It's actually more common than I thought. This is the third island that Texas has taken. The other ones are much smaller. One was a 40-acre island. It was clearly on the U.S. side. Another one was a 1-acre island. And they were used mostly for immigrants. The immigrants would cross half the river and then hide and wait, and then it would be really easy to kind of break up the trip, the crossing that way. What's different about this island, though, is that this is not really an immigrant smuggling. They do come through there now, but for years and years, this is just a hardcore drug smuggling, criminal activity. The guys that are hanging around there are armed to the teeth with fully automatic machine guns and the whole thing. And for now, we'll see whether they kind of move to some other area to use that island, because it's denied to them now. There are other islands, though, so I'm kind of wondering we're all kind of wondering what's going to happen. There's not far away, there are some pretty big other islands, too.
We got about a minute left, but I mean,
Okay.
was there infrastructure there? Like, what did you actually see there?
There's nothing there. Nobody really owns it. There was a fence that somebody, like a barbed wire fence. There was a donkey out there. Somebody owns a donkey. The donkey was just running away from us. And that's about it. It's just a brushy, thick island with a lot of thick brush and grass and trees and stuff. But the cartels use it as an arms cache. Right across where the Texans are going to be are heights, though, that have houses that say the names of the cartel on them, bullet-riddled houses, and snipers' perches all over the place. And they have
You mean cartel snipers?
The cartels have the sniper advantage on the Texans, so I don't think we've heard the last of this thing. The Texans are going to be at constant risk from the other side. The Mexican government does not control that area at all over there. Whenever they've gone in there to try it, the cartels will just battle them out of there. And they're also battling each other. So, I mean, it's a really crazy place right there. But
military needs to go and clean that rat's nest out.
At this point, as of Monday, when they took it back. So we'll see what happens. It's worth watching, though.
Well, Todd, incredible work, and thanks again for joining us. I appreciate it.
Idaho, you had a homeless shelter that was shut down. And after the shelter closed, you had 6 individuals who were found sleeping on the street. And because sleeping on public property was in violation of the city's ordinances, they were given citations. However, instead of just moving along, these 6 individuals filed a lawsuit against the city of Boise, Idaho, arguing that the city's anti-camping laws violated the constitutional rights, specifically the rights under the 8th Amendment. And just for your reference, the 8th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution reads as follows, quote, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And so these 6 homeless individuals were arguing that these laws, which kept them from camping on the city streets, represented a cruel and unusual punishment. And once you know it, after 9 years of going through the legal system, back in the year 2018, the case found itself in front of the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, which, for your reference, has jurisdiction over 9 western states: Alaska, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. And after reviewing the case, the 9th Circuit wound up ruling in favor of the homeless. They found that the city's ordinances, which outlaw camping on public property, violated the 8th Amendment of these homeless individuals. Or to be more specific, they ruled that, quote, the 8th Amendment prohibits the imposition of criminal penalties for sitting, sleeping, or lying outside on public property for homeless individuals who cannot obtain shelter. And so, what this ruling means in practice is that if a city doesn't have enough beds in their shelter system to put up every single homeless person, the city is not allowed to enforce the laws against public camping. Or, as the court wrote it, quote, the government cannot prosecute homeless people for sleeping in public if there is a greater number of homeless individuals in a jurisdiction than the number of available shelter spaces. Okay, so this ruling was issued back in 2018, meaning in practical terms that for the past 5 years now, cities over in the West have essentially been handcuffed in terms of what they could do. And so, because of this ruling, you had cities in the western part of the country get a little bit, you can say, creative with how they dealt with their ever-growing homeless population. And so what you began to see is that cities started to criminalize other activities related to outdoor camping, which brings us neatly along to the case that found its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. There is a city in the southern part of Oregon called Grants Pass. It's a fairly small city located close to the Oregon-California border, and it has a population of only about 38,000 people. And like many cities over in the state of Oregon, Grants Pass began to have homeless encampments pop up, with tents being pitched right there on city streets. However, because of that earlier ruling from the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, the city of Grants Pass attempted to use an administrative approach to deal with the problem. Quote, the city enforced their public camping ordinance through civil administrative fines. The city's ordinance criminalized repeated violations after administrative fines were issued and prohibited the use of certain sleeping accessories, such as blankets and pillows. And so they tried to work around the contours of the earlier ruling, meaning that, for one, in the city of Grants Pass, you weren't allowed to use tents, blankets, and pillows when sleeping on the street. And secondly, you could be given a fine for sleeping on the street, and if you don't deal with the fine, you can get a criminal penalty. Their law was essentially a workaround to deal with the earlier ruling that came down from the 9th Circuit. Instead of dealing with these people criminally, they were using administrative enforcement. And so, the city began to hand out tickets and fines to these homeless individuals who were breaking the law by sleeping on the street. However, what happened was that 3 of these homeless people, they filed a lawsuit against the city, arguing that the laws which fine them for sleeping in public were, just like in the previous case, a violation of their Eighth Amendment rights. Specifically, it was an excessive fine as well as a cruel and unusual punishment. And once you know it, the trial judge agreed with the homeless plaintiffs. Quote, the trial court judge agreed with the plaintiffs, finding parts of the city's ordinances unconstitutional in light of the precedent set in the Boise case, and issued an injunction prohibiting the city from enforcement. The court determined that although the earlier Boise case only involved criminal prosecution, administrative enforcement that ultimately could result in criminal enforcement also violates the Eighth Amendment, and that certain basic sleeping elements were within the protection under the precedent. Meaning, in plain English, that if you have people sleeping there on public streets, you really cannot do anything. Now, the city of Grants Pass appealed that decision, going all the way up once again to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and once again, the Ninth Circuit ruled in favor of the homeless, and they expanded their earlier decision to, quote, cover not only the criminal enforcement of ordinances concerning sleeping in public, but also administrative enforcement that could result in criminal enforcement, and redefining the term sleeping to include rudimentary forms of protection from the elements, as well as overnight sleeping in vehicles. Meaning that according to this ruling, in addition to the previous ruling, not only can cities not criminally enforce these anti-camping laws, but also they can't enforce those laws through fines or anything else. Basically, because of this ruling that came out of the Ninth Circuit, as well as that previous ruling from 2018, if you live in the western part of the U.S. and you have a homeless encampment spring up in your neighborhood, well, the police and the city can do nothing about it, even if they want to. Now, the lawyers representing the city of Grants Pass did not take this decision lying down, and instead, they appealed this ruling all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, writing as a part of their appeal to the court that, quote, these decisions have erected a judicial roadblock preventing a comprehensive response to the growth of public encampments in the West. The consequences of inaction are dire for those living both in and near encampments. Crime, fires, the reemergence of medieval diseases, environmental harm, and record levels of drug overdoses and deaths on public streets.
Medieval diseases.
And then they simply asked the U.S. Supreme Court to answer the following question. Quote, does the enforcement of generally applicable laws regulating camping on public property constitute cruel and unusual punishment prohibited by the Eighth Amendment? And as such, this appeal is requesting that the U.S. Supreme Court take up the case. Now, given the fact that homeless encampments have sprung up across the entirety of the country, the subject matter in this case is probably enough to warrant the U.S. Supreme Court to accept the case for review. However, adding to the weight of its importance is the fact that just earlier this week, you had the attorney generals of 20 different states submit a petition asking the Supreme Court to overturn the Ninth Circuit's decision. The 20 attorney generals, they submitted this court briefing here, you can see it up on your screen, wherein they said the following, quote, allowing encampments is cruel and creates more suffering than the alternative. While being mindful of the health and safety of both the homeless population and that of the greater community, many issues still must be resolved by the Supreme Court to clarify what other efforts may be made within the bounds of the law. The questions raised by this case are of paramount importance to local governments and warrant this court's thoughtful attention. Also, in a news release that accompanied this court filing, you had the Attorney General of Montana add that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has made the states essentially powerless to deal with the problem of homelessness. Now, these 20 attorney generals who signed on to this court briefing were all from Republican-led states. That's really not that surprising. However, what is surprising is the fact that California Governor Gavin Newsom joined these conservative states. Governor Newsom, he filed his own appeal asking the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case. And in a statement alongside his appeal, here was what Governor Newsom had to say. Quote, while I agree with the basic principle that a city shouldn't criminalize homeless individuals for sleeping outside when they have nowhere else to go within the city's boundaries, courts continue to reach well beyond that narrow limit to block any number of reasonable efforts to protect homeless individuals and the broader public from the harms of uncontrolled encampments. Courts have tied the hands of state and local governments that seek to use common sense approaches to clean our streets and provide help to Californians living in inhumane conditions. Additionally, when he was speaking with Politico on this matter just earlier this month, Gavin Newsom added this, quote, I hope this goes to the Supreme Court, and that's a heck of a statement from a progressive Democrat. It's gone too far. People's lives are at risk. And so, there you have it. 5 years ago, the extremely liberal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals helped to create a situation that led to the homeless encampment problem that we currently have in the country. And it's gotten so bad that pretty much everyone on the West Coast, conservative and liberal, is clamoring for the U.S. Supreme Court to step in and allow them to once again enforce the laws that are already on the books. Now, in terms of the next steps, the U.S. Supreme Court has until early October to make a decision as to whether they'll take on the case or not. So essentially, within the next 2 weeks, we'll know whether they accepted the case. And then, if they decide to take on the case, well, on average, it takes the U.S. Supreme Court several months or sometimes even longer than a year to actually decide on the issue. Meaning that potentially, by the year 2024, we could have a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court which would allow local cities to once again enforce their anti-camping laws, and perhaps cities like San Francisco, Portland, Los Angeles, Seattle, and all the rest of them can actually get cleaned up. Although on the flip side, if the court decides to not take up the case, or if they take it up and rule in favor of the homeless, well, then very likely the homeless encampments will only continue to grow ever larger.